From strange experimental machines to the legendary T-34 to Russia's most modern armored designs. The history of Russian tanks is not just a story about steel, guns, and tracks. It is a story about how one nation learned to turn industrial power into battlefield force. From the strange prototypes of Imperial Russia to the armored giants of the Soviet Union, and then into the post-Soviet era of modern main battle tanks, each vehicle reflects a different stage in Russian military thinking. Some were failures, some became legends, and some helped shape the future of armored warfare itself. To understand why Russian tanks had such a huge impact on military history, we have to begin at the very start.
Vzdekot was one of Russia's earliest attempts to create an armored vehicle capable of crossing difficult battlefield terrain. It was not a true modern tank in the way we understand the term today, but it showed that Russian designers were already thinking seriously about mobility, armor, and battlefield survival. It never changed the course of war, and it never became a famous combat machine, but it mattered because it marked the beginning. Vzdekot was one of the first signs that Russia wanted to enter the age of armored warfare. Tsar tank is one of the strangest armored vehicles ever designed. With its enormous front wheels and bizarre shape, it looked more like something from science fiction than a practical war machine. It was bold, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. But the same features that made it unforgettable also made it deeply flawed. It was too awkward, too vulnerable, and too impractical for real battlefield use. Tsar tank failed, but it taught an important lesson. A tank does not need to look impressive to matter. It needs to work. The T-14, also known as the MS-1, was the Soviet Union's first domestically designed and produced tank. It was small, simple, and limited in performance, but that was not its true importance. Its real value was that it gave Soviet industry the experience it needed. Building armor, designing turrets, organizing tank units, and learning how to manufacture tracked combat vehicles at scale all began here. The T-14 was not a battlefield legend, but it was the foundation stone of Soviet armored development. The BT-2 represented a new direction in Soviet tank thinking. Instead of building only slow armored vehicles for infantry support, the Soviets wanted speed, mobility, and deep battlefield penetration. The BT-2 was part of that vision. It was still an early and imperfect design, but it showed clearly that the Soviet Union believed future wars would be fast and highly mobile. More importantly, it pushed Soviet engineers toward the concepts that would later become essential in some of the most famous tanks ever built. The BT-7 was a more mature and refined version of the fast tank idea. It was quicker, more capable, and more useful as both a weapon and a learning platform. The BT series may not be as famous today as the T-34, but it played a major role in preparing the Soviet Union for what came next. In many ways, the BT-7 was one of the last important steps before Soviet tank design reached a true breakthrough. It helped turn the idea of speed and maneuver into a serious combat doctrine. The T-26 was one of the tanks that helped the Soviet Union build armored strength on a much larger scale. It was not especially fast, heavily armored, or revolutionary, but it was widely produced and widely used. That made it important. The T-26 showed a pattern that would appear again and again in Russian tank history. The most important tank is not always the most advanced one. Sometimes it is the vehicle that can be built in large numbers, deployed everywhere, and kept running during long wars. The T-28 reflected a period when the Soviet Union was still experimenting with different paths in armored warfare. Larger and more heavily armed than many earlier vehicles, it was intended to support breakthrough operations against fortified positions. It showed ambition, but it also showed the problems that come with complexity. The T-28 was not the final answer, but it was a valuable step in the learning process. It helped Soviet designers better understand what worked, what did not, and what a future war machine would really need. The T-35 looked like a land battleship. With multiple turrets and a huge silhouette, it seemed to represent raw power and overwhelming firepower. But in reality, it also represented the limits of that idea. It was too large, too complex, and too difficult to use effectively in fast-moving combat. The T-35 could impress during a parade, but war is not won by appearance. Its weaknesses helped prove that successful tanks needed balance, not excess. The T-34 was the true turning point in Russian tank history and one of the most important tanks of World War II. It combined strong sloped armor, solid firepower, and impressive mobility in a way that shocked many German forces in 1941. It was not perfect. Crew conditions were rough and production quality could vary, but it was exactly the kind of tank the Soviet Union needed: effective, durable, and manufacturable in huge numbers. The T-34 did not just fight in the war, it changed the way the world thought about tank design. The KV-1 represented a different Soviet approach from the T-34. Instead of balance, it focused on heavy armor and battlefield durability. In the early stages of the war, many German anti-tank weapons struggled against it, and that gave the KV-1 a fearsome reputation. It was not as mobile or as flexible as some other tanks, but that was not its purpose. The KV-1 existed to absorb punishment and hold the line. It showed that Soviet armor could be not only practical and numerous, but also brutally difficult to destroy. The KV-2 hardly looked like a normal tank at all. With its massive turret and heavy gun, it resembled a moving bunker more than a conventional armored vehicle. Its role was to smash strong points and fortified positions, and in that role, it was extremely intimidating. But the same features that gave it such power also made it clumsy and hard to use in mobile warfare. The KV-2 was a dramatic battlefield tool, but not a flexible one. It remains one of the clearest examples of how powerful firepower alone is not enough. As the war evolved, the T-34 had to evolve with it. The T-34-85 was the improved version, equipped with a more powerful gun and a better turret layout, giving it a stronger chance against newer German tanks. What made it so important was that it improved the original design without abandoning the core philosophy that made the T-34 successful in the first place. It remained practical, effective, and well-suited for mass war. The T-34-85 helped extend the life of a tank design that had already become historic. The IS-2 represented Soviet heavy armor at its most powerful during the final stage of World War II. Armed with a huge 122mm gun and protected by strong armor, it was built to destroy hardened targets and confront the heaviest enemy vehicles. It was not about speed or elegance, it was about impact. The IS-2 was the hammer of Soviet offensives, designed to break through resistance and support major assaults. It proved that the Soviet Union could build not only efficient medium tanks, but also terrifying heavy machines when the battlefield demanded them. The IS-3 arrived near the end of the war, but its design pointed clearly toward the future. With its lower profile and more modern armor shape, it looked different from many of the tanks that came before it. The IS-3 did not define the outcome of the war, but it made a huge impression on the post-war world. It suggested that Soviet tank design was entering a new era, one shaped not only by brute strength, but by a more refined understanding of survivability, form, and battlefield efficiency. The T-44 was an important transitional tank, sitting between the wartime T-34 and the post-war Soviet tanks that followed. It was designed to keep the strengths of the T-34 while improving protection, balance, and overall layout. Although it arrived too late to become a major symbol of World War II, the T-44 mattered because it helped shape the future. In many ways, it was the bridge between Soviet wartime tank design and the more modern armored vehicles that would define the Cold War era. After World War II, the T-54 opened a new chapter in Soviet armored history. This was the beginning of the post-war generation, when the Soviet Union shifted from global war to Cold War readiness. The T-54 offered strong firepower, solid protection, and a design that could be produced on a massive scale. That combination made it extremely important. It was not flashy, but it was practical, balanced, and reliable enough to become one of the most influential tanks of the post-war period. From this point on, Soviet tank power became a global presence. The T-62 was the next major step in the steady evolution of Soviet tank firepower. It introduced a larger gun and showed that the Soviet Union was continuing to adapt its tanks for more demanding battlefield conditions. It may not be the most famous Soviet tank, but it played a key role in bridging the gap between earlier post-war designs and the more advanced vehicles that followed. The T-62 is important because it represents continuity, not a revolution, but a deliberate effort to keep Soviet armor competitive in a changing military world. The T-64 marked a major technological leap in Soviet tank design. This was no longer just about improving an older formula. It was about creating a more advanced kind of main battle tank, with stronger firepower, modern systems, and a more compact battlefield profile. The T-64 was highly important, even if it is less famous outside military history circles. It helped define the direction of Soviet armored development in the modern era. In many ways, it was the tank that helped shape what later Soviet and Russian tanks would become. If there is one post-war Soviet tank that truly became a global symbol, it is the T-72. It balanced firepower, protection, compact design, and mass production in a way that made it highly practical and widely used. The T-72 was not just a tank, it was a philosophy on tracks. It reflected the Soviet belief that armored warfare required not only advanced machines, but large numbers of workable, effective vehicles that could be built, maintained, and deployed in huge quantities. That is why the T-72 remained relevant for so long.
The T-80 represented a more ambitious side of Soviet tank design. With its gas turbine engine and powerful acceleration, it looked and felt more advanced than many of the vehicles that came before it. It was fast, modern, and impressive. But it also raised an old question in Russian armored history. Is the best tank the most advanced one, or the one that can be sustained most effectively in real war? The T-80 embodied speed and sophistication, but it also reminded everyone that performance always comes with a cost. The T-90 belongs to the post-Soviet era, when Russia had to preserve military strength under very different political and economic conditions. Rather than starting from zero, Russia chose to improve proven designs. That is what makes the T-90 so important. It was not a radical break from the past. It was a practical evolution of the T-72 tradition, improved in protection, fire control, and battlefield survivability. In that sense, the T-90 is a very Russian tank, not built to impress on paper, but built to remain useful, fieldable, and relevant. The T-14 Armata is the most futuristic tank on this list, and easily one of the most ambitious. It was presented as the symbol of a new generation of Russian armored warfare, with a more advanced design and a very different battlefield concept. But modern war is harsh to expensive promises. The T-14 became famous very quickly, yet its real-world role has remained limited compared with older, upgraded tanks still doing most of the work. That makes Armata fascinating. It is both a vision of the future and a reminder that military technology matters only when it can truly be fielded. When we look back at the full history of Russian tanks, one thing becomes very clear. This is not just a story of machines, it is a story of doctrine, industry, survival, and adaptation. From strange early experiments like the Tsar tank to the battlefield legend of the T-34, to Cold War workhorses like the T-54 and T-72, and finally to modern designs like the T-90 and T-14, Russian tanks have reflected the way Russia prepares for war in every era. Some of these vehicles became icons, some were stepping stones, some changed history, while others revealed the limits of ambition. But together, they form one of the most influential armored lineages in modern military history. And that is what makes Russian tank history so compelling. It is not just about which tank was bigger, faster, or more powerful. It is about which designs actually survived, which ones could be built in huge numbers, and which ones shaped the battlefield for decades. From the mud of World War I to the armored warfare of today, The story of Russian tanks is really the story of how Russia learned to fight on tracks.